My journey to figuring out ETFs, especially on eToro, was definitely a bumpy ride. I already made quite a few videos along the way documenting lessons learned and acknowledging my mistakes. This time, I know it for sure. Yeah, I hope so. In this video, I want to showcase you 7 different ETFs that you can actually buy on eToro without CFD contracts, meaning you can actually own them. Okay, let's start with the first one, and I need to be reading those because the names of these ETFs are just crazy complicated, to be honest. Not sure why. Maybe it's just me, but either way. So the first one is iShares Core FTSE 100 ETF. And that's basically 100 largest UK companies with a very low expense ratio of 0.07%, which is really good. Biggest holdings include companies like Shell, which is in an energy sector. We have HSBC Bank, and then we have JSK, which is a pharmaceutical healthcare type of company. By the way, I'll leave the links to all of the ETFs in the description below, so you can actually check out the full list of the holdings, expense ratios, and all other details if you need to. As you can see from the graph, it's been growing quite steady with many ups and downs and acting as a usual ETF. So this is a great ETF to diversify your portfolio if you have already exposure to USA companies, S&P 500 index fund, other European indexes, and so on. This is basically you investing in the largest 100 companies listed in the UK. So the next ETF that we have on the list is iShares Core MSCI World ETF. And it's basically a broad exposure to a variety of global companies. Majority of them, 70% actually, is comprised of USA companies, and the rest 30% is from another developed countries such as UK, Japan, France, Germany, etc. Expense ratio for this one is quite expensive, is 0.2%, so you are paying a bit more than the previous mentioned ETF. Biggest holdings for this ETF are of course all of the USA companies like Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, Meta, etc. Since the inception of this fund in 2009, the growth has been very steep for this fund, and it probably makes sense because it has 70% of the companies are US companies and in the tech sector, which grew dramatically over the past decade. So this particular ETF is good for somebody that wants to diversify but doesn't want to have to track different ETFs, a lot of different indexes, ETFs, funds, whatever. This is basically a simplest way to diversify across all 23 developed countries, including USA, of course, has a 70%. Other developed countries comprise of 30%. So you have kind of a good balance of all of the growth stocks in USA, but also you are exposed to other markets in the world, which is kind of basically you're investing in a overall world market ETF. And it's easy for you because you don't need to track different ETFs. You can just invest in one of them. However, it is more expensive, so you have to take into consideration that you are paying more for not selecting ETFs yourself and just putting everything in one ETF. Next on our list is iShares Core S&P 500 ETF, and if you know anything about ETFs, you know this particular ETF. This is basically a way for Europeans to invest in S&P 500. I was actually looking for that for a long time, and I finally found out it is possible to own this particular ETF. If you don't know, this is basically 500 largest companies in the USA. The expense ratio is only 0.07%, which basically matches all of the Vanguard-like ETFs in the USA. So it's amazing because holdings are, of course, Apple, Microsoft, Tesla, all of these companies. And I mean, do you need to know the growth of the S&P 500? If you are familiar with this particular ETF, then you've seen the graph. You know it's been steady, it's been growing. Everybody's on the internet recommending this particular fund. And I do actually suggest starting investing in this ETF first and then diversifying your portfolio later when you have the budget and the means to invest more in other ETFs. Okay, so the next one is iShares Core S&P 500 ETF as well, but there's a big difference here. So it's basically everything is the same as the previous ETF as I mentioned, but this one actually pays out dividends quarterly. So as these two are basically identical, the only way you need to consider is basically if you want dividends to be paid out to you or if you want them to be reinvested automatically for you. There are kind of pros and cons for each of those. My personal kind of suggestion is to go with the previous ETF that I mentioned, which basically reinvest dividends for you, because then you don't, first of all, you don't have to reinvest dividends for yourself if that's kind of your goal, and you don't have to deal with taxes and all of that stuff. It simplifies the process way more. However, if your investing strategy is something where you actually want to take out dividends and pay themselves to you, then of course this is just another S&P 500 ETF. Okay, next one is iShares Core MSCI Europe ETF, and basically this ETF comprises of the most major companies in Europe. It has an expense ratio of 0.12%, which is quite okay. The biggest companies are of course also included, like UK companies like Shell or HSBC, but then we have also Airbus companies. If we look at the graph, we see that there's nothing unusual with this particular ETF. You basically invest in all of the European companies, and this ETF is also great for diversifying. So again, if you have invested already in the Japanese market or USA companies and you want your portfolio to comprise of some other diversification, investing in the whole Europe as a region, the biggest companies here might be the way to go. Next one is iShares NASDAQ 100 ETF. And this ETF basically comprises of top 100 non-financial companies in the NASDAQ index, which basically means it's 50% of that whole index, or 50% of companies are tech stocks. Expense ratio is actually quite expensive, it's 0.33%. But considering that it basically 50% of the whole fund invests in the tech stocks, which had an amazing decade, and if we look at the graph, we see a huge steep growth. I think it outperforms every other ETF on this particular list. So it makes sense that it is a bit more expensive, but of course it's a way more riskier ETF. So this one is simple. If you want to avoid any financial companies and you want to be heavily dependent on a tech sector, this ETF is definitely for you, but I would say it's for more advanced people. If you want something a bit more reliable, I would actually go for S&P 500 type of ETF, just because first of all, it's way less expensive and you are actually exposed to a lot more companies. So, you kind of diversify your risk. However, if you already have other things invested in and you want specifically to focus on the NASDAQ 100 non-financial companies, this is the ETF for you. And the last one is SPDR S&P US Dividend Aristocrat ETF. This ETF is focused on high dividend yielding companies which have increased their dividends for the last 20 years. This ETF is the most expensive ETF out of all the ETFs I mentioned, with 0.35% expense ratio. Companies that are included in this list are like ExxonMobil, Chevron, Coca-Cola, and Walmart. To be honest, growth for this particular ETF doesn't really matter, because if you want to invest in this ETF, you're basically investing because you want to get dividend payments to you instead of actually looking at the overall growth of the ETF. Although if we do look at the graph, the ETF has been growing steadily, so it's kind of a bonus, but the main point of this ETF is to get paid out dividends from the highest yielding dividend companies out there. But buying ETFs is actually not that simple. Please check out this video where I show basically the reasons why I stopped actually buying ETFs and now why I'm coming back to them. It's been a journey, and there's a lot of complicated processes. So check that video out for more context. But that's it from me. Take care. Ciao.